Redwood Creek, Montana. The clang of the auction bell at Redstone Yard shattered the frosty morning air. Dust rose as 3 German shepherds, one worn-down mother and her 2 trembling pups, were hauled into the open yard on heavy chains. Their ribs showed, their eyes flickered with exhaustion, and the crowd turned away. No hands lifted, no bids came. No one stepped forward until a weathered Marine pushed through the line of onlookers. His boots crunched on the frozen ground, and in his coat pocket sat his last $200 along with a dented harmonica. When he offered his money, laughter erupted from every corner of the yard. By evening, though, that laughter would be silenced, because what he chose to do that day wasn't just about rescuing 3 forsaken animals. It would ripple outward, changing lives, reshaping a community, and maybe, just maybe, reminding people of mercy. Before we walk through this tale, drop your country in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe no living being deserves to be abandoned, hit that subscribe button. This story might carry the miracle you've been waiting for. Autumn in Redwood Creek had a hush to it, as if the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains themselves were holding their breath. Each morning arrived pale and cold, the sun climbing reluctantly over the ridges while the valley filled with curling fog that spilled down like a living thing. Silver mist drifted through the meadows, coating everything in a ghostly sheen. At the farthest edge of town, where the pavement gave way first to gravel and then to dirt, sat a lonely cabin. It looked less like a home and more like a forgotten relic. Its tin roof was patched with mismatched sheets, hammered into place by a man with more stubbornness than money. The chimney leaned crookedly, unsure if it could stand through another winter. The wooden steps creaked like old bones under the weight of any boot. This was the home of Thomas Granger. Granger was 52, a former Marine who carried the years on his back like stones in a rucksack. His frame still bore the shadow of the strength he once commanded, tall, broad-shouldered, but solitude and thin meals had whittled him lean. His hair, cropped short, had turned iron gray. The lines on his face were carved by desert suns and Montana winters, and faint scars traced his jaw without offering their stories. His eyes, a muted steel blue, had the faraway look of a man who had stared too long across horizons that never brought his brothers home. Though his beard never grew wild, he shaved as best he could, he carried himself with quiet discipline. His boots were brushed clean, his shirts patched twice over but always neat, and his trousers, though worn, were tidy. People in town saw him as a man more at home in silence than in conversation. They called him the quiet soldier, or simply Old Marine Granger. It wasn't mockery, just the uneasy distance of townsfolk who didn't know how to speak to a man whose silences weighed heavier than their words. That morning, like so many before, Thomas sat on the sagging porch with a dented tin mug of black coffee warming his hands. The air bit at his cheeks, pine carried on the breeze mixed with the smell of wood smoke from his stove. His harmonica rested on the railing beside him, its edge bent from a fall years ago. He lifted it to his lips, and a low tune drifted into the fog, a sound somewhere between a lullaby and a lament. Everyone in Redwood Creek had grown used to that sound. To them, it was part of the valley. They heard it and thought, there goes the quiet soldier again, speaking in notes instead of words. When he came to town, it was never more than twice a month. Flour, coffee, lamp oil, maybe a can of stew, that was all he bought. He never lingered, never shared more than a nod. At Webb's general store, Martha Webb often rang up his purchases. Martha, sturdy and silver-haired, had lived through her own hardships, losing her husband in a mining accident decades before. That loss had sharpened her patience into steel. She never asked questions when Thomas laid his goods on the counter. She would simply say, "Morning, Mr. Granger," and he would nod once, answer with a plain "morning," and leave. It was a rhythm, unbroken, the kind that didn't need words. To survive, he worked odd jobs, splitting firewood for the elderly, patching fences, mending roofs no one else dared climb. The pay was just enough to scrape by. In the drawer beside his bed, he kept $32 and some scattered coins, his savings for winter. He had no wife to write to him, no children to wait for him, no family left at all. His possessions boiled down to a patched-up cabin, an old harmonica, a battered marine medal kept in a tin box under his cot, and a pile of memories too heavy to carry yet impossible to bury. The children whispered about him in the summers. "He's a ghost," some said. "A hermit," said others. Adults were kinder, but always cautious. Redwood Creek was a town that lived on community, and Thomas chose solitude. That made him both respected and set apart. On this particular morning, the mist rolled away slow, revealing a meadow brushed with frost. Thomas finished his coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. His knees ached when he stood, reminders of an old fall during service. Still, he moved with the steady caution of a Marine on patrol. Inside, his stove snapped with the hiss of fire against cold iron. By midday, his boots carried him down the dirt path into town. Redwood Creek streets were lined with clapboard buildings, their paint faded but sturdy against the wind. Old hitching posts still stood, though pickups had taken the horses' places. Children ran wild through the dust, and a dog barked somewhere near the saloon. At the post office, a new flyer had been nailed to the board. A crowd of ranch hands, broad-shouldered and dust-covered, stood clustered around it. One spat into the dirt, muttering, "That Blackwood's back. Vulture." Another sneered, "This time, he says he's got something special." The name Victor Blackwood sent a chill through the gathered men. Everyone in Montana knew it. Mid-40s, tall, with slick-back black hair and eyes like cold steel. Always draped in a long black coat, always polished boots, always carrying himself with the swagger of a man who profited from misery. He dealt in animals, rodeos, bloodsport. Cruelty wasn't an accident for him, it was a trade. His arrival in any town meant trouble. Thomas stepped closer, scanning the flyer. Special auction, Redstone Yard. Rare stock. Saturday. Don't miss it. That was all it said, but it was enough. "It's dogs," one rancher muttered. "Big ones. Fighting kind." Another added, "He'll sell 'em to the pits. That's what Blackwood does. Blood, bets, suffering." Then a younger man, quieter, spoke. "Word is, he's bringing a German shepherd and 2 pups. Barely standin'. A silence fell. Even men hardened by ranch life shifted uneasily. "Worthless," one finally snorted, but the unease lingered. Thomas's jaw tightened. Memories surfaced, memories of a black and tan shepherd named Rex, a K9 who had once sniffed out a mine and saved 3 Marines. Rex hadn't made it home. That memory was still a wound. He turned from the board, boots crunching over gravel, but the words clung to him like burrs: 3 shepherds, half dead, for sale. Martha Webb was sweeping the porch of her store as he passed. She caught his expression and asked softly, "You heard?" Thomas only nodded. "Nothing good ever comes with Blackwood in town," she muttered, shaking her head. "Best you steer clear." But Thomas said nothing. His hand brushed the harmonica in his pocket, felt the weight of the metal in its tin box back home, and heard a voice deep inside, one that spoke of duty, of debts unpaid. By sundown, the whole town knew. Blackwood's auction was coming. And though Thomas walked home with his same steady, silent stride, something in him had shifted. The soldier who once chose solitude was about to make a choice that would not let him rest. Redstone Yard sat on the far outskirts of Redwood Creek, a weather-beaten stockyard with railings blackened by years of livestock and dust. On Saturday morning, it pulsed with noise and motion. Pickups rattled into the lot, horses snorted at the hitching posts, and families bundled in plaid shawls or heavy coats crowded the wooden rails. The sharp air carried the smells of hay, manure, and cheap cigars, mingling with the hum of gossip. The clang of the auction bell rang out, cutting through the chatter. Men pushed forward to get a better view, boots grinding on frozen dirt. Women clutched their skirts as children peeked over the rails, their eyes wide with curiosity they didn't fully understand. At the back of the crowd stood Thomas Granger. His patched coat hung loose on his broad frame, his hands buried in its pockets, his jaw set in stone. He told himself he had come only to watch, but his pulse betrayed him. Years of training kept his face calm, yet the old scar along his jaw ticked as he clenched it. The weight of his harmonica in his pocket was a reminder, he couldn't pretend to be only a bystander. And then Victor Blackwood appeared. He strode onto the raised platform, his long black coat swirling with practice drama, his hair gleaming with oil, and his grin thin and sharp as a blade. He didn't need the auctioneer's hammer, the menace in his voice alone commanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he drawled, eyes sweeping across the gathered faces, "today I bring you something rare. Something this yard has never seen." He gestured toward the side gate. Two handlers dragged chains across the boards, the sound metallic and harsh. Both men were cut from the same cloth, thick-armed, rough-skinned, their eyes dulled by the habit of cruelty. One, Pike, wore a greasy cap pulled low over his brow, the other, Hollis, walked with a crooked gait, his leg badly set from an old break. When they yanked the gate open, silence fell. A yelp pierced the air, followed by the clink of chains. Then the mother dog appeared. A German shepherd, maybe 4 or 5 years old, staggered into the yard. Her sable coat was tangled with dried mud and streaked with blood. One ear drooped from an old wound, and her ribs jutted sharp under her skin. Her right hind leg dragged as though every step drove nails into her bones. Yet her eyes, dark, fierce, unbroken, still burned with defiance. Behind her stumbled 2 pups, hardly 6 months old. The smaller, a reddish-brown male, coughed weakly, his body so frail that every breath rattled in his chest. He staggered sideways each time the chain pulled. The other, a pale tan female with black saddle markings, was larger but hollow-eyed. Her paws were too big for her frame, her head hung low, and her frightened gaze darted at every shadow. The crowd shifted. A few gasped. Others sneered. "They'll never fight," one man scoffed. "Worthless," another muttered. A sharp-faced woman whispered to her friend, "Best they be put down." Children tugged at their mother's sleeves, wanting to see more, but stern hands pulled them back. Blackwood spread his arms theatrically. "Behold! Pure bloodlines, fit for work, guard, or other purposes." His grin widened, wolf-like. "A fine mother, and her brats. Who will start me at 500 for the lot?" The yard erupted in laughter. 500? For skeletons. They'd fetch more at the rendering plant. Men hooted, some spitting into the dirt, others jostling each other with jeers. Thomas felt heat rise under his collar. He couldn't look away from the mother. Despite her wounds, she stood between the handlers and her pups, pressing her frail body against them whenever one stumbled. Her tail hung limp, but her stance was that of a soldier refusing to surrender. Rex's memory flooded back, the K-9 who had thrown himself on a mine to save a squad of Marines. Thomas had lived. Rex had not. That ghost pressed hard on his chest as he watched the battered mother dog shield her young. Blackwood sneered at the laughter. "What? No takers? Afraid of a little responsibility? These beasts are trained through hardship. With proper discipline, they'll pay their way. Who'll start me at 400? 3. No hands rose. Hollis yanked the chain and the male pup collapsed with a whimper. A young boy near the rails cried, "Mama," before being hushed. Even in cruelty, no one in the crowd dared lift a hand. Thomas's breath grew heavy. He thought of the $32 in his drawer, the 68 from chopping wood last week, and the 100 tucked away for winter supplies. 200 total, the last thread between him and hunger when the snows came. He closed his eyes. In the silence, he heard the tune of his harmonica, the one he always played in the lonely hours, the one that had once made Rex prick his ears. When Thomas opened his eyes, his voice carried farther than he expected. "I'll take them." The yard stilled. Then laughter exploded again, sharper than before. Old Marine's lost his mind. Pike barked. "Save your money, soldier," someone jeered. "Buy yourself a coffin instead." Blackwood's grin faltered for just a moment, then twisted. "Did I hear you right? 200, for the lot." Thomas stepped forward, pulling a battered envelope from his coat. Its edges were soft from years of folding and unfolding. "Every cent I have," he said flatly. He tossed the envelope onto the platform, the paper slapping against the wood with finality. "They're alive. That's enough for me." The auctioneer hesitated, then slammed his hammer down with a crack. "Sold. To Mr. Thomas Granger." The laughter thinned into uneasy murmurs. Some shook their heads, muttering about foolishness. Others shifted uncomfortably, suddenly seeing the dogs differently now that someone had claimed them. Blackwood retrieved the envelope, flipping through the bills. His eyes glittered with disdain and a flicker of intrigue. "Enjoy your charity cases, Marine," he said, voice low and venomous. "They'll eat you alive before winter does." Thomas ignored him. He stepped forward as Pike shoved the chains into his hands. The mother's eyes met his, dark, wary, but carrying a spark of recognition. Slowly, carefully, he crouched, letting her scent him. She bared her teeth, but didn't lunge. The pups huddled against her side, trembling. The crowd's voices buzzed behind him, but Thomas heard none of it. He gathered the chains, rose to his full height, and walked out of the yard with steady steps. The laughter followed him, sharp and mocking, but already fading. At the edge of the road, the clouds broke, and sunlight spilled across the valley. The dogs stumbled beside him, chains clinking like broken shackles. His pockets were empty, his winter uncertain, but inside him, something long dormant stirred awake. The road from Redstone Yard stretched long and uneven, dust rising in pale clouds as Thomas Granger guided the three shepherds toward his cabin at the edge of the woods. The chains clinked softly with each step, punctuated by the labored breathing of the animals. The mother limped close to her pups, pressing her thin body against them whenever they stumbled. The little male coughed, his ribs heaving like every breath was a battle. The female, pale tan with oversized paws, walked with her head lowered, her wary eyes flicking to every sound as though danger lurked in each shadow. Passers-by along the road stopped to stare. Some shook their heads, muttering under their breath. Others whispered behind calloused hands. Marine's lost his sense, one rancher scoffed. "Won't last till Christmas." By the time Thomas turned onto the dirt lane that led to his weather-beaten cabin, word of what he had done was already racing through town faster than his boots carried him. The cabin stood lonely at the edge of the pines. Its patched walls leaned against the wind, a shed beside it sagging as though the next storm might topple it. Thomas unhooked the chains with slow, careful movements, speaking softly to the animals in a low voice meant to soothe. He guided them into the shed, where he had laid out old blankets and hay gathered from a neighbor's unused stack. The mother sniffed suspiciously, but exhaustion pulled her down onto the bedding, the pups curling into the hollow of her chest. Thomas lingered in the doorway, his pockets now empty, his savings reduced to nothing more than memory. Winter crouched only weeks away. Still, he stood watch as if guarding something worth far more than the dollars he had handed over. By morning, the town was buzzing. At Webb's General Store, the wooden bell above the door jingled non-stop as folks came and went, carrying more gossip than groceries. Martha Webb, wiry and sharp-eyed, tried to still the talk, but her voice was drowned in the tide. "He'll starve himself before the snow's through," one rancher muttered as he leaned over a barrel of nails. "Fool's gone soft in the head," another said, shaking his head. A thin, sharp-faced woman hissed, "Those mutts are diseased. My children could catch it. The sheriff ought to be told." Near the counter stood Emily Henley, the town's young veterinarian. She was in her early 30s, her chestnut hair tied back into a practical ponytail, boots still muddy from her morning rounds. Her oval face, lined with high cheekbones, carried a seriousness beyond her years. Her hazel-green eyes, thoughtful and observant, betrayed a compassion she tried to hide behind a layer of caution. Emily had grown up in Redwood Creek. Her father, a farrier, had died when a horse threw him during her teenage years. That loss had hardened her, carved her into someone relentless in her work but guarded in her heart. She treated every animal with quiet determination, even when others dismissed the cases as hopeless. Listening to the gossip, Emily stayed silent. She knew the risks: neglected dogs carried sickness, aggression, and danger. Yet she had also seen the look in Thomas Granger's eyes when they crossed paths on Main Street. The look of a man carrying too much already, yet unwilling to set down the burden of compassion. Her lips pressed together, but her gaze drifted to Martha, who caught it and gave her a knowing, understanding nod. That afternoon, Thomas came into town for flour and lamp oil. His broad frame moved quietly through the aisles, head down, his pockets rattling with the last of his coins. Whispers rose around him like a tide. Near the doorway, a group of ranchers lingered. At their front stood Carl Dempsey, a burly cattleman in his 50s with thick forearms and a voice as sharp as his temper. He owned one of the largest spreads near Redwood Creek and carried himself like the land itself bent to his will. As Thomas stepped out with his flour sack slung in one hand, Carl's narrow eyes followed him. His words carried loud enough for everyone on Main Street to hear. "You think you're saving souls, soldier? Those dogs will bring sickness to this town. Mark me, you'll regret it." Thomas didn't answer. His boots scraped the gravel, steady and measured, as he walked away. He had heard worse on foreign soil. Mockery and threats meant nothing new to him. But the sting cut deeper here, in a place where he was already an outsider. The days that followed were uneasy. Children whispered as they passed the edge of his lane, daring each other to creep toward the shed where the dogs lay. Mothers pulled them back, muttering warnings about disease. At the feed store, groups of men talked openly about calling the sheriff to end the problem before it grew teeth. Even at Sunday service, the preacher's sermon carried a thinly veiled warning: some burdens are too heavy for one man to carry. Sometimes beasts weigh a soul down more than it can bear. Emily saw Thomas again outside her small clinic. He stopped, quiet as always, to ask if she had spare bandages. She handed him a bundle without a word, her eyes catching his for a moment before she turned away, afraid that sympathy might betray her. 2 nights later, the mist rolled thick from the river, and the moon hid behind clouds. Headlights appeared on Thomas's lane. 3 trucks pulled up, their engines growling rough. Carl Dempsey climbed down first, lantern in one hand. 4 other ranchers followed, their breath steaming in the cold. Shadows stretched long in the lamplight. Carl pointed the lantern toward the shed. "Granger, we won't have diseased curs infecting our stock. If those mutts make trouble, we'll put them down ourselves." Thomas stepped out onto his porch, the lamplight hardening the lines of his scarred face. He stood tall, the old Marine posture straight and unyielding. His voice came low, steady. "They're not leaving here. Not unless it's through me." From the shed came a faint growl, the mother dog, weak but defiant. The pups whimpered, a sound small but enough to reach the gathered men. The night hung thick, every breath a cloud, every hand twitching near coat pockets where ropes or knives might wait. Carl spat into the dirt, his lip curled. "Your funeral, soldier. But hear me plain, if they cross my land or breathe near my herd, I'll finish it myself." He turned, the others trailing, their boots crunching over gravel as they climbed into their trucks. Engines roared, and the smell of exhaust lingered long after their taillights vanished into the night. Thomas remained on the porch, lantern light flickering against the scars on his face. Behind him, the dogs huddled close together, their breaths shallow but alive. The town might turn against him, winter might starve him, but Thomas Granger would not yield. Early November settled over Redwood Creek like a hand that would not let go. Frost silvered the grass each dawn, and the wind carried the sharp scent of snow waiting just beyond the horizon. In the leaning shed behind Thomas Granger's cabin, the three shepherds lay curled together on a bed of hay and old blankets. But warmth alone was not enough. Their breaths came shallow, ribs rising and falling with effort. Each hour seemed to drag them further into weakness. The mother dog, whom Thomas had begun to call Sable, for the sheen of her coat beneath the grime, lay with her head pressed flat against the hay. Her hind leg had swollen, the wound angry and hot with infection. Each attempt to shift sent a shudder of pain rippling through her body. Yet even through her exhaustion, her dark eyes never left her pups. The smaller pup, reddish-coated and frail, Thomas had named Rusty. He trembled constantly, his cough rattling deep, each breath whistling harshly in his chest. Foam flecked the corners of his mouth, his thin frame nearly disappearing against his mother's side. The female, pale-furred with two large paws, he called Luna. She had stopped moving altogether. She lay limp, her body twitching only in spasms, caught between fading dreams and a fight she seemed too weak to win. Thomas knelt beside them, his calloused hand hovering just above Sable's flank, feeling the fever radiating off her body. The smell in the shed was heavy with infection, fear, and slow death. He pressed his lips tight, the ache in his chest one he had known before, on foreign fields, watching comrades slip away despite all his strength. He could not stand by and watch it happen again. By late afternoon, he pulled on his worn marine jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and walked the mile into town. The sky bruised purple with gathering clouds, snow threatening at the edges. His boots crunched on gravel as he pushed toward the whitewashed building at the end of Main Street. The faded sign read, Henley Veterinary Clinic. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and straw. A cat in a wire cage hissed faintly from the corner. Behind the counter, Emily Henley looked up from her ledger. Surprise flickered across her usually composed features at the sight of Thomas filling her doorway. His broad shoulders nearly touched the frame. His face, weathered and scarred, was sharper than usual, his gray-blue eyes lined with a desperation she had never seen in him before. Emily wasn't easily rattled. Years of hardship had forged her into steel. Losing her father as a teenager had taught her to carry burdens alone, and years assisting the old veterinarian before training formally had taught her to guard her compassion carefully. Too often in Redwood Creek, kindness was mistaken for weakness. But the Marine standing in her clinic was asking for more than medicine. Thomas stepped forward, removed his glove, and placed something on the counter. A small silver horseshoe charm, tarnished by time. A keepsake once carried across oceans. His voice was low, hoarse. "They're dying, Emily. The mother's leg is infected. The boy can hardly breathe. The girl hasn't moved since morning. I don't have much to give, only this. But I'm asking." Emily stared at the charm. She recognized it for what it was, a piece of service, a thing carried not for luck but for survival. Her throat tightened. Still, she folded her arms, steadying her voice. "Thomas, you need to understand. Dogs that far gone can bring sickness into your home. Parvo, distemper, diseases that could spread across the whole town. And even if they're clean, they may not live through the night. If I put my clinic's tools into them, it might mean turning away animals I could actually save tomorrow." Her words came hard, but her eyes betrayed her. Thomas leaned forward, resting his scarred hand beside the horseshoe. His voice steadied into something quiet but immovable. "I don't have family. I don't have much left of anything. But I won't watch them die in that shed. I swore once to leave no one behind. I can't break it again." The ticking clock on the wall filled the silence. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping despite herself. "You're a fool, Granger," she murmured. "But I'll help." That evening, she followed him to the cabin, her old truck rattling over the rutted lane. In the passenger seat lay a battered leather satchel filled with syringes, gauze, antiseptic, and a single bag of saline. The stench inside the shed made her pause at the doorway, but she pressed forward, kneeling beside Sable. "She's septic," she muttered to herself, pulling out supplies. Her hands moved with sharp, practiced precision as she flushed dirt and pus from the wound. Sable growled, low and threatening. Thomas knelt close, lifting his harmonica. A soft, steady tune threaded through the air, half sorrow, half lullaby. The sound stilled the dog just long enough for Emily to work. Rusty panicked at the needle, his frail body trembling violently. But again, the harmonica's strange song calmed him, holding him steady while Emily injected the antibiotics and wrapped his narrow chest. Luna lay limp in Thomas's lap, her breaths barely there. Emily's hands were delicate as she slid a thin four-line into her fragile paw, taping it gently. Thomas's breath caught when, moments later, her chest rose faintly under the slow drip of saline. Hours dragged into the night. Thomas fetched water, boiled rags, held the animals still when needed. Emily worked tirelessly, sweat dampening her temples, her ponytail falling loose. The lantern cast long shadows across the wooden walls while outside, the first snowflakes hissed against the tin roof. By dawn, Luna stirred faintly, her paws twitching as though reaching for life. Rusty's breathing was still shallow, but less ragged. Sable, fevered and weak, turned her head and licked Thomas's wrist once as his hand rested on her side. Emily leaned back on her heels, exhaustion in every line of her body. "They're not safe yet," she whispered. "But they've made it through the night. That's something." Thomas set the harmonica down beside the tarnished horseshoe on the shelf. His voice came quiet, resolute. "That's more than I asked for." By the third morning, snow had laid its quiet claim over Redwood Creek. The meadow around Thomas Granger's cabin stretched white and unbroken, muffling every sound. Smoke curled from his chimney in thin ribbons, and in the leaning shed behind the cabin, the faint warmth of a pot-bellied stove fought back the winter bite. It had taken half his stacked firewood to move the old stove into the shed, but Thomas hadn't hesitated. Heat meant breath in lungs, and for Sable, Rusty, and Luna, each breath was borrowed time. Rusty stirred first. His ribs still jutted, his legs wobbled beneath him, but determination pushed him forward. One morning, when Thomas opened the shed door, the reddish pup staggered upright. He managed 2 shaky steps before tumbling into the hay. Thomas knelt, steadying him with one scarred hand. Rusty coughed, then wagged his thin tail once. Just once. But that single flick was enough to cut through Thomas's armor, like sunlight through storm clouds. Luna remained quieter, cautious. Her pale tan fur had been brushed clean by Thomas's careful hands, and though she still startled at sudden movement, her eyes followed her brother with quiet attention. When Thomas lifted her gently from the blankets, she pressed her head into his palm, not in fear but in trust. That small gesture rooted itself deep in his chest, a weight and a gift all at once. Sable, the mother, was slower to mend. Her wounds wept at times, the fever returning in waves, but she no longer fought him the way she had at first. One evening, under the lantern's glow, Thomas dipped a rag into warm water and wiped dirt and blood from her swollen leg. Her lips twitched back in warning once, but exhaustion, or something else, stilled her. She lowered her head and allowed him to tend her. Emily Henley visited twice that week. She arrived bundled in her green coat and wool scarf, boots damp with snow, carrying more antibiotics and rolls of gauze. On her second visit, she found Thomas seated cross-legged on the shed floor, both pups cradled against his chest. His harmonica rested against his lips, the tune low, mournful, but steady. Sable lay nearby, her dark eyes half-closed. The pups dozed against his heartbeat, lulled by the strange music. Emily stood in the doorway, her breath caught in the cold air. She whispered to herself, almost too soft to hear, "They don't trust me yet. But with you, they're trying." Her voice carried something else too, admiration, maybe concern, maybe both. She was used to animals shying from her at first, but she had never seen creatures this broken lean so quickly into the presence of another. It unsettled her, even as it warmed something inside. The town, meanwhile, had not softened. At Webb's general store, old Mr. Claiborne, stooped with age and stiff from years of logging, muttered, "Granger's wasting away feeding beasts that'll never pay him back." Martha Webb snapped sharply in reply, her gray eyes flashing. "You weren't there when Blackwood dragged them out." No one else lifted a finger. "Least you could do is let the man be." But suspicion clung to the townsfolk like the frost on the pines. For every whispered word of respect, 3 more warnings followed. Back at the cabin, trust was being built, piece by fragile piece. On the 5th night after Emily had first come, Thomas sat in the shed with the lantern dimmed low. His harmonica lay in his lap, his hands folded over it. He spoke more than played this time, his words soft, meant only for the dogs. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you again." The pups curled against his legs, their breath steadier now. Sable shifted closer, the chains that once bound her long since cut away. Then, slowly, painfully, she rose. Limping, she pressed her weight forward and lowered her head onto his shoulder. Her fur smelled of hay and medicine, her body trembled with weakness, but the gesture landed like a blow. Thomas froze. Then, with eyes closing against the burn, he lifted a hand to rest against her neck. His breath hitched, and the tears came, tears he hadn't allowed since the war, since the faces of men he could not save. They cut lines through the weathered planes of his cheek as he bent his head. In the doorway, Emily lingered longer than she intended. She watched in silence, her own eyes stinging though she told herself it was only the cold. She turned quietly, boots crunching on snow as she left him with his moment. Inside, Thomas whispered into the dog's fur, his voice raw. "I've carried ghosts long enough. Maybe it's time I carried you." The night outside was bitter, the snow falling heavy. But in that lantern-lit shed, beneath the hush of the storm, something long buried in Thomas Granger stirred awake, connection, trust, and the fragile beginning of hope. The snow deepened across Redwood Creek, muffling the land under white silence. Thomas Granger had grown used to waking every few hours, stoking the stove in the shed, making sure Sable, Rusty, and Luna were warm enough to keep death from creeping in. He slept in his marine jacket more often than not, boots by the door, as though instinct warned him that danger prowled nearby. On the 3rd night after Sable had pressed her head against his shoulder, that instinct proved right. It was near midnight when the hum of engines broke the stillness. Headlights cut through the trees, their beams sweeping across the snow like searchlights. 3 black trucks rolled up the lane toward the cabin, their tires grinding against ice, their exhaust steaming in the cold. Thomas was already at the window, jaw set, one hand pulling on his boots. He opened the door before the trucks even stopped, the lantern glow casting his frame in silhouette. The vehicles screeched to a halt. Doors slammed. Men climbed out, heavy boots crunching snow. They wore dark coats, collars turned high, caps pulled low. Their movements were too sharp, too rehearsed, not the careless gait of locals. At their front stood a tall man with a hawk nose and a clipped black beard. In one gloved hand he held a folder. His voice, when he called out, carried the crisp coldness of someone who'd practiced lies until they rang like truth. "Federal agents," he announced. "We have orders to seize the animals housed here. Step aside, Mr. Granger." Thomas stood square in the doorway, his shoulders filling the frame, his marine posture iron straight. His voice was low, steady. "You'll show me those orders." The bearded man stepped forward, extending the folder. Thomas flipped it open in the lantern light. The paper bore an official seal, but the ink was smudged where no seal should ever smear. The language was vague, the signatures wrong. He'd seen plenty of forged papers in other lands, under harsher suns. He closed the folder calmly. "This is fake," he said flatly. "And those dogs are mine." Bought them at Redstone Yard, fair and legal. I've got the bill of sale. He stepped inside, returned moments later with the folded slip signed by the auctioneer, the ink smudged by Blackwood's disdainful hand. He held it out into the freezing air. Here's the only paper that matters. The leader's sneer faltered, but before he could reply, another set of headlights swept across the lane. A patrol truck rolled into view, its red beacon faint against the falling snow. Sheriff Henry Clay stepped out, snow crunching beneath his boots. Clay was a man in his late 50s, broad in the chest, his silver hair cropped close, his face weathered by long Montana winters and longer nights of keeping order. He moved not like a politician but like a rancher who'd taken up law reluctantly, carrying justice more like a burden than a badge. "Evening, Granger," he said, his voice gravel steady. Then he turned to the men in dark coats, his tone sharpening. "What's this about?" The hawk-nosed leader raised the forged papers again. Clay didn't even glance at them. "I don't need to see that," he said. "I know every badge that rides into my county, and you're not it. Now clear out before I haul you all into town for trespassing." A ripple of tension cut through the group. One man shifted his weight. Another spat into the snow. The leader narrowed his eyes, but finally jerked his chin toward the trucks. The men filed back in, slamming doors, engines growling. But as the lead truck rolled past, the bearded man leaned out his window. His voice sliced through the night like a blade. "This isn't over, Marine. Next time, you won't see us coming. Those dogs will vanish." The trucks rumbled away, swallowed by the snow and trees. The silence they left behind was heavy, like a breath that refused to release. Sheriff Clay turned back, his expression firm but not unkind. "You've stirred a nest, Granger. Blackwood doesn't like being made a fool of. He'll send worse before he's done." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I didn't take them to give them back." Clay studied him for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "Keep that paper close. And keep your lantern burning. Trouble likes the dark." With that, he climbed into his patrol truck, its red light fading down the lane until the night swallowed it whole. Thomas stepped back into the shed. The dogs were awake, ears pricked, bodies taut. Sable growled low, Rusty pressed against his leg, Luna trembling but not from fear, something older, something more primal, as though they sensed the fight waiting in the dark. Thomas crouched, resting his hand on Sable's neck. Her eyes met his, dark and unwavering. In that moment, he knew. They were no longer just rescued strays. They were allies now, survivors bound together, staring into the same storm. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the stirrings of the Marine he once was. Not in uniform, not under command, but in the steady readiness that hummed in his bones. War had come to his doorstep. And though all he had was 3 battered dogs and an old harmonica, he would not yield. The night closed in, snow falling harder, and in the dim lantern glow, Thomas saw his reflection in Sable's eyes, scarred, weary, but unbroken. The fight was only beginning. Snow clung heavy to the roofs of Redwood Creek when the storm broke over Thomas Granger's land. The night was still, the kind of silence that pressed on the chest, until the growl of engines shattered it. Headlights split the tree-line as 6 vehicles crawled up the frozen lane. Tires bit into ice, exhaust steamed like smoke from beasts, and men spilled out into the snow. Hard-faced, leather-gloved, rifles slung carelessly across shoulders. At their center walked Victor Blackwood. His black coat swept the drifts behind him, his slicked back hair catching the cold gleam of headlights. His sharp smile carried arrogance, but his eyes burned fever-bright, the hunger of a man whose pride had been wounded and would not rest until vengeance was fed. Around him stalked hired guns, faces cut by old bar brawls, knuckles swollen from years of paid violence. One had a crooked ear, another a scar carving from chin to collar. None moved like ranchers, they moved like predators. Thomas stepped onto his porch, the lantern burning behind him casting his tall frame into silhouette. His Marine stance was unmistakable, squared shoulders, chin set, the steady calm of a man who had walked into worse storms before. Sable stood at his side, hackles bristling, teeth flashing white in the half-light. Rusty pressed close behind, his thin body trembling but his eyes sharp. Luna leaned against her brother, her ears back but her gaze unyielding. Blackwood stopped in the yard, his coat billowing in the headlights, his grin thin and cruel. "Evening, Marine," he called, his voice oily, slicing through the cold. "I've come to collect what's mine." Before Thomas could answer, another light appeared on the road, a slower rumble, more measured. Sheriff Henry Clay's patrol truck rolled forward, its red beacon glowing faintly in the storm. Behind him came townsfolk, fewer than a dozen, but they came. Martha Webb clutching a lantern, her wiry frame small but unshaken. Carl Dempsey, the rancher who had once threatened Thomas, now grim-faced, torn between old pride and a dawning sense of duty. 2 young brothers followed, carrying little more than pitchforks, their boots sinking into snow but their jaws tight. Clay stepped forward, hand resting near his revolver. His voice was steady, carrying authority honed over decades. "Victor Blackwood," he said, "you've gone far enough. Turn around. Take your men with you." Victor laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that bounced against the barn walls. "Sheriff, you think your paper law means anything here? These dogs are mine. Stolen property. I've come to reclaim them." Thomas's voice cut through the night, iron flat. "That's a lie and you know it. I bought them fair. You sold them because no one else would." He shifted, his voice hardening. "They're not going back to chains." The air froze between them. A gun cocked. The first shot cracked into the night sky, shattering the stillness. Chaos erupted. Blackwood's men surged forward, rifles firing, muzzle flashes lighting the snow like bursts of lightning. Sheriff Clay's revolver barked back, his broad frame holding the line. The brothers swung their pitchforks, shoving men away from the shed. Thomas dove from the porch, rolling to shield the pups. Sable lunged with a guttural snarl, her teeth sinking into a gunman's arm, dragging him down into the snow. He screamed, his rifle tumbling free. Rusty, frail but fierce, darted forward. He latched onto another man's wrist as the thug raised a gun. The pup's small body shook with effort, but his bite held, buying seconds. The shot went wild, the bullet harmless against the sky. Luna, though weak, threw herself between Rusty and a boot swinging down. The blow struck her ribs with a yelp, but she didn't back down. The yard became a blur of gunfire, shouts, snow churned to mud. Martha Webb, wiry but fierce in her 60s, hurled her lantern at a man charging the shed. Flames licked across his coat, forcing him to roll in the snow. Carl Dempsey, the same rancher who once swore to kill the dogs, swung a fence post like a club. He knocked a gunman sprawling with a roar that echoed off the hills. Through the smoke and chaos, Thomas fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. He grappled one of Blackwood's thugs, twisting the rifle from his grip with a move learned long ago, then slammed him hard into the frozen ground. His breath came fast, his muscles burned, but he never faltered. Then a sound rose above the din, the baying of other dogs. From the edge of town, half a dozen farm dogs barreled into the fray. Mongrels, shepherd mixes, hounds, all drawn by Sable's furious call. They came as a ragged pack, snapping and snarling, throwing themselves against Blackwood's men. One leapt onto the hood of a truck, another sank teeth into a thug's leg. The balance shifted. Blackwood's sneer faltered as he watched his men falter, not only against townsfolk but against beasts of the very kind he had sought to break. With rage twisting his face, he raised a pistol, aiming straight at Thomas. But before he could fire, Sheriff Clay's revolver cracked. The pistol spun from Blackwood's hand, skittering into the snow. The fight ended as abruptly as it began. Sirens wailed in the distance. Real federal vehicles this time, headlights cresting the ridge. Blackwood's men scattered, some fled, others tackled into the mud. Badges flashed in the lights. Victor Blackwood, clutching his bleeding hand, dropped to his knees. His black coat pooled around him like a dark stain. Shackles clicked shut around his wrists. "You'll regret this, Granger," he hissed. But the fight was gone from him. Thomas dropped to his knees beside the dogs. Sable pressed against his side, her muzzle bloodied, her eyes blazing with loyalty. Rusty panted hard, crawling into his lap. Luna whimpered softly, bruised but alive. Thomas wrapped his arms around them, holding them tight as if the world might still try to tear them away. The yard stank of gunpowder and smoke, churned into mud and ice. But for the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel alone. The Marine who once returned from war carrying only ghosts now had allies pressed against his chest, warm, breathing, alive. In the flashing patrol lights, amid the chaos of victory, Thomas bowed his head and whispered, "We're still here. Together." Morning broke over Redwood Creek with skies washed clear after the storm. The snow lay heavy on the rooftops and fences, glittering under the pale winter sun. The yard around Thomas Granger's cabin bore the scars of battle, mud churned with footprints, splintered boards, spent cartridges half buried in the drifts. Yet through the ruin, silence carried a weight different than before. It was not dread this time, but peace. Victor Blackwood had been hauled away in chains, cursing and spitting like a rabid dog. His empire of cruelty, the fighting pits whispered about in hushed tones, the broken animals he'd turned into coin, all of it was unraveling under federal hands. The false papers, the bribes, the blood-soaked wagers, all dragged into the light. The townfolk who had stood in Thomas's yard the night before returned in the daylight. Martha Webb carried a basket of bread and broth. Carl Dempsey, humbled, brought hay bales to shore up the shed. The brothers hauled water from the well. Their help was clumsy, awkward, but it carried something the town had withheld from Thomas for years, acceptance. "You saved more than dogs last night," Martha said quietly, pressing a hand to his arm. "You reminded us what kind of people we ought to be." Thomas only nodded, words caught in his throat. In the days that followed, the cabin transformed. The shed was repaired, new boards hammered into place, the stove fed with wood offered by neighbors. Thomas laid fresh bedding for Sable, Rusty, and Luna. And others began to come. A boy from the South Farm arrived with a limping collie. A widow brought a spaniel left behind by her late husband. A logger carried in a half-starved mutt found wandering the ridge. Each came with apologies, excuses, explanations, but Thomas asked for none. He simply opened the door, spread hay, and let the animals curl into warmth. By the second week, the shed had no space left. Thomas and Emily, who had returned again and again despite her protests of "only to check," built a lean-to beside it. Her hands were quick with rope knots, his steady with hammer and nail. "Don't call it mine," Thomas said one evening, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. "It belongs to them." Emily studied him quietly, her hazel eyes softening in the glow of the lantern. "Then it's a sanctuary," she said simply. The word settled between them like a seed in fertile ground. Sable's strength returned first. Though her leg still bore a limp, she carried herself with quiet dignity. At night she lay at the shed entrance, keeping watch, the same defiance in her eyes that first struck Thomas at Redstone Yard, but now sharpened into pride. Rusty grew bolder by the day. His cough softened, his ribs slowly covered with new weight. He shadowed Thomas's steps constantly, his tail wagging whenever the harmonica came out. Luna remained the gentlest. She followed Emily most, padding softly behind her as though drawn to her quiet steadiness. One snowy morning, when Emily bent to check her paws, Luna pressed her muzzle into Emily's gloved hand. Emily froze, then smiled, a small, rare smile that Thomas noticed and carried with him longer than he meant to. The town's gossip shifted like the wind. Where once they'd muttered of disease and folly, they now spoke of bravery. Parents brought children to peer through the fence at the growing pack of heeled strays. Farmers nodded respectfully when Thomas passed in town. Carl Dempsey, once his loudest critic, arrived one afternoon with a burlap sack of feed. He stood awkwardly, clearing his throat. "Marine," he said roughly, "if you ever need a hand, you call me." He left without waiting for reply, but the gesture rang louder than words. Even the preacher, whose sermon had once warned against burdens, came to the cabin one evening. He stood outside in the snow, hat in his hands, and offered only 4 words, "Thank you for reminding us." Then he left, the sound of his boots fading into the stillness. On the first clear night after Blackwood's arrest, Thomas sat by the shed door with his harmonica. The stars stretched wide above the valley, the snow reflecting their cold fire. He played softly, a tune neither mournful nor triumphant, something in between. The dogs gathered close, Sable at his right side, Rusty curled against his boot, Luna resting her head on Emily's knee. Emily sat beside him in silence, her breath clouding the air. After a long while, she spoke, her voice quiet. "You built this out of nothing, Thomas. Out of scraps, out of stubbornness. Maybe even out of grief." She glanced at him, her hazel eyes catching the starlight. "But look at it now. They're alive. And so are you." Thomas lowered the harmonica, his scarred hands resting in his lap. He looked at the animals, their eyes reflecting lantern glow, their bodies pressed close for warmth. For the first time in years, the emptiness inside him wasn't a void but a space filled with something steady. Hope. He drew a breath, his voice rough but sure. "It's not just mine anymore. It belongs to anyone who needs it." Emily smiled faintly, and for once, she didn't look away. The snow kept falling that winter, thick and endless. But inside the cabin and shed, life grew louder. Barking, howling, laughter, even from Thomas, though it surprised him when it came. And word spread beyond Redwood Creek. Travelers carried the tale, of a scarred Marine who had spent his last dollar on broken dogs, and of a sanctuary rising in the mountains where no creature was turned away. Some called it foolish. Others called it mercy. But those who saw it, who felt the warmth in the eyes of the dogs who had once been chained, called it something else entirely. A miracle.